nice and neat.
Do you want the light for your notes?
You know, I'm probably going to mostly step over here, and I'll just grab them off of there. I think it'll be good.
Do you want the stage? It's too late now.
Too late now.
That would have been cool though.
Don't want the mask? I want the mask.
All right, so you're okay
Still
without.
waiting on that wizard.
You're all right without
I
lights.
am. Thank you. Man behind the curtain. I'm even scratching things out.
You tend to walk a lot, or kind of just stand?
Mostly just right here. I won't wander way over there, I don't think.
Is this
Will it
pretty
matter?
slide heavy? Is there a lot of
Yeah.
change?
Yeah.
So I'll spend most of the time just
Here, clicky clicky.
sliding.
Yeah.
You got this.
Thank you. Editing as we go.
Keep going. Finish your presentation. Don't mind me. No, I work.
We have to wait till exactly the moment.
Well,
Moment of
let me
death.
double check. There's people coming in. Yeah, we met. What's that? Okay, he's going to be in the lobby. You look so much like Rosie just then.
Sticking out my tongue, maybe.
No, with her chin, your mouth is similar. Yeah, you resemble. All right.
Compliment to me.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martha Cole. I'm a historical specialist here at the Montana Historical Society, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the 5th presentation in our Montana History in 9 Easy Lessons series. A little preview for next week, we'll be having Homesteading, Boom, and Bust presented by Professor Emeritus Robert Swarthout, so make sure to come back for that. If you missed the first 4 of these, they are all on YouTube. So you can go to the Montana Historical Society's YouTube channel and watch them from the comfort of your own home. Or if you have a friend, you came and you know someone who man, so-and-so would have really loved it, including this presentation. It'll take us a couple of days, but we'll have a link up to YouTube to watch this. If you're a teacher, see me after and I will sign your renewal form. If you didn't bring one, I've got extras, or if this is your first time, I have forms for you. All right, and with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Today's talk is Disintegration, Montana's Tribal Nations in the Early Reservation Years through the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. Quite a mouthful and a huge topic to fit into an hour. So it's with great admiration that I introduce Laura Ferguson, who is condensing this history down for us. She earned her master's degree in Native American Studies at Montana State University. Since 2010, she's worked as an instructor of Native American Studies and Native American Literature at Carroll College and Helena College, and as a writer and editor of Indian Education for All Educator Resources. Ferguson is a co-author of Beyond Schoolmarms and Madams, which is a collection of biographical sketches on Montana women for sale in our bookstore. She is a great friend and a good colleague who currently works as associate editor with Montana, the magazine of Western history here at the Montana Historical Society. So please join me in welcoming Laura Ferguson.
Hello. Sound good? Cool. All right. So as Martha said, we're going to try and condense basically about 55 years worth of history into about 55 minutes. Could be kind of fun. So just as a way to start and kind of frame this talk, this era between 1879 and 1934 really is a time when tribal communities and tribal landscapes are being disintegrated, being fragmented and broken into pieces, and that process has had long-lasting repercussions. So just an overview here of the federal assimilation policy era. The ultimate goal is to end all things tribal. That would include tribal sovereignty, tribes' attachment to their landscapes and their histories, communally owned property, their religious and cultural practices, tribal languages, their family structures, and ultimately their identity as a tribal unit. Instead, the goal of the United States is to remake Indians in the image of white people, make them into farmers and wage laborers, Christianize them, teach them to speak English as their primary language, encourage them to become American citizens. And there's a lot of emphasis on developing a sense of family as a nuclear family and the sense of individualism in Native people at this time. In order to make that happen, the the federal government puts into place a series of practices and policies. And as an umbrella, these are framed as being things that are good for the Indian, hence this article from the Anaconda Standard of 1909, The Uplift of the Indian, a practical experiment. This is seen as America's great civilizing mission. To do that, the Secretary of the Interior and the Indian Bureau in the Interior Department will have great control, almost 100% control over over tribal affairs on the reservations. Reservations themselves are regarded as temporary, as sort of a holding place until Indians can be brought out of a state of pupillage and can become full-fledged American citizens. So there's also an attack on reservation treaty lands. The Dawes Act is put into effect, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then there's a lot of forms of cultural oppression that are going to go on, outlawing of certain ceremonies, and this cultural reprogramming that's put into place via missions, the boarding schools, farm programs, and other institutions. Again, there is a huge emphasis on individualism, each Indian person thinking of himself as herself, separate from the tribe, rather than thinking of the tribe as a whole. So before we get to the Allotment Act, we need to kind of go back and look at European American views on land. And that means we're going to go back at least as far as Thomas Jefferson. Europeans viewed land as a commodity and as something that had a transferable title. Private land ownership confers both wealth and status. When you think about those folks from England who came over to the New World, a lot of them were not landowners in England. So for them, that marker of wealth and status through land ownership was really, really important. And that idea persisted well into the late 1800s. Jefferson believed that the yeoman farmer was an American ideal. This ideal man was a farmer. He was a hard worker. He was productive, and he earned his own way in life. He also believed that Indians have too much land. This is how America framed its Indian problem. The Indians have too much land. And Jefferson said the way to solve that problem was to divest them of their land by getting them into debt. This is what is known as the factory system, based on the factory model where the workers constantly had to buy from the factory store, rent from the factory owner, and they're constantly in this cycle of having to keep working and never being able to get ahead because they always owe the big boss something. This is illegal, by the way, in terms of federal Indian policy. It violated the 1790 Trade and Intercourse Act, but nonetheless, Jefferson encouraged that exact process. And the idea of it lingers in the American conscience and in the political system long enough that it comes full fruition in 1887 with the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act is the act that creates allotment to break apart tribally owned and occupied lands that were guaranteed to tribes in their treaties, often for their exclusive use and occupation, but to break those into individual plots of lands, and they could vary from 30 acres to even 640 acres. In Montana, it was more often that those would be the size of 80 acres, 120, and occasionally 320 acres. To do that would sever those tribal ties to the landscape. It would also free up a lot of land for white settlement, again, violating those treaties, by declaring that land surplus. It wasn't necessarily needed by the tribe. And therefore, it would also speed up assimilation process by promoting each individual landowner as responsible for his or her allotment and making a living at it. The goal of the Allotment Act, the overarching goal, is to eventually dismantle the reservations and thereby eliminate tribal sovereignty. In a sense, it's making Indian people sort of like the immigrant homesteaders who came into the West, that they would have their little plot of land, they'd have to prove up on it and show that they could make a go of it, rather than being a whole tribe that would work together communally owning land. For a time, under the Dawes Act, land would be allotted in trust status, which meant that the federal government technically owns the land and manages it in trust for the Indians, where it's kept by the federal government. Trust lands cannot be bought or sold. So there's a clause in the Dawes Act and in subsequent allotment acts pertaining to each different tribe that trust land would eventually convert to fee status land. Fee patent land is land that you can sell. It can be taken if you owe a debt. The title is transferable. This is an example of an allotment agent who came from Montana. This is Helen Clark. She's Scottish American and Blackfeet. And Helen Clark had this sort of tremendous career. She was born in 1846. So you can see her career get started right during the allotment era. She's an actress, she's a teacher. She was elected one of the first county superintendent of schools in Montana that was female. Also the first Native person to be elected in Montana, and that was here in Lewis and Clark County. She was also an allotment agent. This is sort of the lesser-known detail about Helen Clark. And she was not allowed, interestingly enough, to serve as the allotment agent for the Blackfeet tribe, which was her mother's own tribe, because the Indian agent up on the Blackfeet Reservation said, well, you might do too good of a job, right? So they sent her to Kansas. She spent 3 years trying to convince 2 different tribes that did not want their reservation allotted that they should, in fact, accept this process and get busy doing what they needed to do to become an allotted tribe. She also became an advocate for the Blackfeet people. In around 1903, she went up to the Blackfeet Reservation at the request of the Blackfeet tribe. At that time, the tribe was being allotted, and their Indian agent, who's sort of the arm of the federal government that lives on the reservation, he's not an Indian, but he is an agent, had told tribal members, if you don't accept your allotments and come up here and sign your name to a plot of land, I will withhold your rations. And rations are really our food, that is payment in kind for lands that the federal government took from tribes during the treaty era. So they really can't be withheld. It's not, if you do this, then you get your rations. Rations are due to the tribal members. So he's saying, well, we'll just take you off the rolls. Well, she sues him for maladministration, and she wins. And so she's helpful to get the Blackfeet tribal members back on the tribal rolls, and then can facilitate a better allotment process for that tribe. Here's an irony about Helen Clark. She had worked for the federal government for 3 years. She'd also been a teacher and a superintendent and an actress, completely fluent in both English and Blackfeet. She applied for allotment on her mother's reservation, the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, and was told she would have to prove, if she wanted that land in fee status, she would have to prove that she was competent to manage that land. And there were competency commissions out there that evaluated individual Indians and said, well, if you speak some English, maybe you're mixed blood, then you must be competent because you will be able to manage your land properly. And that was one way whether they determined whether you got fee status land or trust land, or if your trust land moved into fee status. Helen Clark had to prove it, that she could, read and write and understood what land was. So the allotment process resulted in checkerboarding of most of the reservations in Montana. This is an old map, and I'll show you a better version of it here in a second, of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And you can see how, even in that old map, it's all broken up into the little tiny sections. It fragmented land by determining who owned that land. The federal government would conduct a survey on each reservation, and those surveys would determine whether it was grassland, water, forested land, which was the primary agricultural land, where a township might be, where a railroad right-of-way needed to go, and it would determine what land should be, according to the federal government, and the allotment agents opened up as surplus. That surplus land then is going to be sold to homesteaders and white settlers. So this is sort of a dual-pronged attack on tribal sovereignty, because their land base is getting broken up, and as they're taking allotments on certain portions of their land, in between those allotments, non-Indians are taking land. So it's harder for them to maintain this cohesion and this political unity on their reservations. And on some reservations, the Flathead is an example in Montana, white settlers soon come to outnumber the Indians on the reservation. That is still true today. This is a slightly better map of the Flathead Reservation, and you can see these are tribally owned lands. These yellow ones are the allotted lands. You'll notice here's, if you know where the river runs through the middle of, river runs through it, that's a Montana story, through the middle of the valley here, you know that this land on the edges where this yellow allotment land is, this tends to be a little bit up away from the river, not the best agricultural land perhaps. And in the middle, all this kind of light white, this is all land that was opened up for homesteading. So the primary agricultural lands were opened up for homesteading. All right, this whole process of allotment is going to bring a lot of new people to the reservation. That is another goal of the allotment process. Intermix white people, Christians, English-speaking people with Indians, and Indians will learn to mimic their white neighbors. Some of those people are the Indian agents who were already on the reservation, but now have even greater control. There are traders and farmers and blacksmiths and teachers and missionaries. The Indian police, they actually are Indians and they're police, and lots of settlers. It's also going to bring trespassers, people who come to the reservation to take advantage of a system that they see has a whole bunch of loopholes. One of those loopholes is getting an Indian into debt and then demanding his land to repay that debt. And here's a poster, a Great Northern Railway advertisement announcing the opening of the Flathead, Coeur d'Alene, and Spokane reservations, which were regarded as prime agricultural land. At this time in Montana, it's important to note that we had somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 landless Indians. Most of them are Metis, Chippewa, or Cree, but not all of them. And they remained landless in Montana until 1916 when the Rocky Boy Reservation is created. Some of them continued to be landless after that. These are a couple different families, one family in Butte, and this is the Denny family who at the time lived on the Crow Reservation. One of the reasons why these groups of people were denied a reservation, which they had been seeking of their own since around 1880, they were denied because white settlers in Montana said, we don't want to lose part of the public domain to Indians. In other words, land transfer could only go in one direction, from Indians to whites, never back again. So they're denied a reservation, in spite of the fact that folks like Plenty Coups, who's sitting in the middle here with some delegates to Washington, D.C., and some representatives of the government, advocated for them. Plenty Coups was the chief of the Crows at the time. He was very, very much opposed to allotment, and he wrote to the federal government, and he actually went to D.C., I think, 5 times and gave basically the same speech each time saying, we don't want our lands allotted, but if you're going to allot them to other Indians. All those landless Indians we have in Montana, let them take up allotments on the Crow Reservation. I'll take care of them. I'll be their father. In fact, if you have landless Indians anywhere in North America, send them to the Crow Reservation. They're welcome to live here. In part, that was because there were already a lot of Crees living on the Crow Reservation, and they worked as laborers. They worked as carpenters, as horse herders, and as people who guarded the borders of the reservation from encroachment from nearby ranchers and their cattle. The superintendent, W.W. Scott, wrote back to the federal government and said, don't play Plenty Coups' game. don't allot these Crees. They belong in Canada. We don't need them in Montana. And really denied Plenty Coups to have that agency over his own reservation and over his own tribe and his lands. What happened to them? This is just an example of a couple of the Cree men who worked up in Birdseye. These men both worked training horses. So Plenty Coups failed to keep that reservation intact and keep it surplus lands from being homesteaded out to whites. But he did succeed in keeping a portion of the reservation, the Wolf Mountains, intact and tribally owned, as in owned by the entire tribal community, which was pretty impressive considering what he was up against. He also succeeded in delaying allotment for quite a long time, which benefited the Crow tribe and gave them time to prepare for that. No, we're not going to read this, don't worry. I just wanted to give you, this is an example. The Crow Act, which was the original Crow Act, it was in 1904, and that was an allotment act. But they delayed some of the allotment process until 1920, and so they passed a second Crow Act. I just want to show you this because it tells you what's happening to that surplus land, all the funds that come from that, where's it going? And who has the power? Well, I'll tell you who has the power and who holds the purse strings, and that's the Secretary of the Interior. All of these expenses, which I add up to almost $600,000 in 1920 money, for irrigation and ditches and maintaining the irrigation and cows and horses and mules and sheep, fences, schools, and the hospital, etc. The list goes on and on. All of this money is coming from the tribe's surplus land. Tribes did not have a say over where that money was going or how it was being spent. And just to share an example that's a little bit more fun than these numbers. Here's an example that was from the Fort Peck Sioux Pioneer, a newspaper, 1917, and it's called Fresh from the Field, Fort Peck, Montana, an outrage against our Indians. And I'm going to read just a snippet of this article. 2 and 2 make 4, but a ditch plus an Indian does not make a farmer. Not by a jugful. Yet the government has constructed a ditch for us at a fancy figure amounting to over $585,000 of our money, roughly the same amount as this Crow money that was being spent. And the Indian Office prides itself with all it has done, quote, for the Indian. The theory on which the Indian Department has worked is this: take the Indian's land away from him, sell it, take the money, and with it build a ditch for the everlasting benefit of the Indians, and the result will be that the Indians, by some unknown miracle not listed in Scripture, will be converted to enterprising farmers. Whether it is an irrigation ditch or not, we can't vouch for. No Indian has ever tried it, and likely never will, for ditches are of little use in raising horses and cows. We are able and competent, the article ends, to think for ourselves if we are given a little credit in that line. That ditch is one of the most brazen holdups and shame-faced propositions we were ever confronted with, and it is high time we voiced our sentiments. We do not condemn irrigation ditches as a whole, but we do object to the using of our money for a ditch which will never benefit us. In fact, at Fort Peck, there were a series of ditches. This was the third one, and you can feel the outrage from the author. A series of 3 ditches built on the reservation, all funded by the sale of surplus lands, and in every case, those ditches did not benefit the native farmers. Those ditches brought water to white settlers who had settled at Fort Peck to become agriculturalists. So that's kind of what tribes are up against. And it's not surprising that in some cases it meant Indian people sunk into even deeper poverty. They don't have access to the same resources they had prior to the reservation era. The buffalo are gone. The reservations have shrunk, so the natural resources that they can access easily are very hard to obtain. Now, under their treaties, a lot of tribes retained the right to leave the reservations and go to their customary places of hunting and gathering or fishing. But in fact, that Indian agent controlled their movement and restricted them and confined them to the reservation most of the time. So they have to adapt to fewer resources and also this checkerboarding system. For some, generally speaking, for the women, that was somewhat easier because they were able to carry on with some of their domestic duties and quietly kind of going about their cultural duties, gathering plant medicines, plant foods, adapting to a new type of meat, but still processing it in the same way. It was much harder for men. You can't go and be a warrior or a buffalo hunter when you're constricted to your 120 acres on your allotment on your reservation. So some of them become cowboys and sort of take up this new career. I should mention one thing about cowboys. In some of the allotment acts that pertain to specific tribes, for example, the 1920 Crow Act, it's mentioned that the tribe's communally owned horse herds and cattle herds would be broken apart. Even they would be allotted X number to each individual. So they couldn't try to do all of this together communally, raising these herds. They had to do it individually and sink or swim individually. The title is actually the title of this photograph, which was by Edward Curtis, The Dawn of Civilization. America saw farming, that ideal put forth by Jefferson, as being the model that they should put on Indians to civilize them and to raise them up to the level of white people in society. And so their relationship to the landscape is changing. Montana's tribes were not farmers, but the federal government said, regardless of the condition of the land or where you are situated on it, you need to become farmers. There were a few Indian agents on reservations that said, it's really kind of hard to farm up here at Bab. Maybe you could make them ranchers instead. But still, sedentary and agriculturalists in a certain sense. The proponents of this whole policy said that the best way to get Indians to comply was a hungry stomach. Basically the same thing they used to force Southern Plains tribes onto the reservations. And allotment will further this expectation and this objective that they cease hunting and gathering, they cease their old mode of life, and they adopt a whole new relationship to the landscape. I should add that the tribes, out of their surplus funds from sale of land, are hiring boss farmers to come in and teach them how to farm. And this is a model family the photograph was taken as a series of photographs in the early 1920s to promote the progress of Blackfeet farmers. And this man standing with all the sacks of grain that he's harvested for this very staged, beautiful picture. But you see, again, it's sort of the nuclear family plus grandma, the wagon, the nice little cabin. This is what Indians are supposed to strive for. And it's not that if they achieved it, they weren't still being Indians or weren't successful in their own right. Of course they were. But it's really being pushed on all of them. Be this. See yourself in this picture. And so it's changing their relationship to that landscape. They also had these agricultural fairs, and this is one of them, where Blackfeet are being instructed in the process of growing grain. I really think that's a fabulous photograph, sorting through the quality and types of grains and how to grow them and when to harvest. And as farming becomes the mode of life that is held up as the model, agricultural fairs and industrial fairs come to not entirely replace, but to attempt to replace seasonal ceremonies that were more traditional tribal ceremonies. And these agricultural fairs, you can get a kind of a sense from this one in the picture before. They promoted everything from quilting to pie making, who could raise the largest and most beautiful ear of corn, which farmer brought in the nicest bushel of peas, who had the nicest shock of grain, and promoted these farming practices in a very overt way to to try to assimilate Indians and to make them act more like white farmers, and to show them what the standard was. And the timing of these is not coincident. A lot of these agricultural fairs are, of course, at the end of the growing season, late summer, early fall, but that's also when a lot of tribes would get together for their final hunt, traditionally, and would do a lot of their ceremonies during that traditional hunting time. They'd have their different social dances. The Crows had their doorway singers that would go from teepee to teepee. And when fairs get implemented like this, they just sort of push all those other ceremonies to the wayside. So there's this double standard. Farmers, Indian farmers, are expected to be successful, but what's happening is that they are actually getting allotted some of the very worst lands on the reservation because of those surveys and because the Indian agent really has a lot of control over who gets what land. So I'm going to read very, very briefly this story, which is true, for Martin Charlot, about his experience becoming a farmer. And Martin Charlot is the son of Chief Charlot, who was one of the Bitterroot Salish who had refused to move from the Bitterroot Valley to the Flathead Reservation. Under the 1855 Hellgate Treaty, the Bitterroot Salish held on to the Bitterroot Valley and were going to stay there. And it says in that treaty that at some date in the future, the land would be surveyed. The Bitterroot Salish interpreted that as being at some date in the future, we're going to have a map. It's going to be all plotted out because the federal government was already pushing them and their white neighbors were already pushing them to become farmers. So they adapted and said, well, we'll go ahead and take up farming. What they did not understand that treaty to mean is that someday they would be removed from that land and forced to settle on the Flathead Reservation. So Martin Charlot's narrating the story, and he starts talking about when they're farming down in the Bitterroot. The agent told my father to tell the people they would receive wheat and oat seed. My father told the tribesmen to do more farming and get the seed. They did. We helped each other with the farm work. Everyone pitched in, everyone else in the harvest. We didn't have threshing machines. We put the grain on buffalo hides that the women had sewn together. Then we led horses over the grain to separate it. Several of the men would lift the robes and shake them in the wind to let the shaft blow out. We also had 2 mills going, and we used to fetch the grain to the mills on pack horses. Imagining 1 grain sack or 2, I guess, on a horse at a time to the mill for all these farmers. Everything was going along fine. We were making a good living and learning the white man's way. Then Garfield came to see us. This is in the 1870s. Garfield told my father that we would have to move out of the Bitterroot and up to the Jocko. The Jocko is what they called the Flathead Reservation at the time. This is my home, my father answered. By the 1855 treaty, we don't have to move. We're going to stay here in the Bitterroot. So they keep farming, and eventually in 1890, the government returns and says, basically, you need to leave. You need to leave, and you need to leave all your stuff behind, basically. The government promises them that their farming equipment would be replaced up on the Jocko, that their household equipment would also be replaced, and that the government would supply logs and help them build the houses on the Flathead Reservation if they would move up there. Martin Charlot tells us, when we got to the Jocko, things were not the way they promised. Whatever we got, we had to work for. There was no new machinery or household stuff for those people who had left theirs behind. We never saw or heard of the 7 head of steers that were to be butchered every Saturday. We never got the cow and the calf apiece like we were promised. And my father did not get his new house. Instead, we cut logs and had to haul them to the mill to make lumber for our houses. We were told to fence the land we wanted and start farming. The men in the tribe did all that work, digging ditches without getting paid for it. After the irrigation system was in, many more people started farming. They were pretty successful farming on both sides of the Jocko River. Remind you, this is before the Flathead Reservation was allotted. But those days didn't last either. Pretty soon, maybe in 15 years, engineers surveyed the reservation. When my father asked why they were doing it, they told him that the government was just making a survey to determine the acreage. But it wasn't long before we were allotted, and the whites moved in. Then the government took a hold of the irrigation system we had built. They made it bigger, all right, but the Indians didn't get the water. Their crops burned up, and some of them went into debt, and pretty soon, most of them quit farming. The white man just took over everything. So that's the experience of one man and his community, how allotment impacted them. In order to survive the years of the early reservation, where poverty really just kept going up and up, it was essential that certain practices be continued. And a lot of times, again, it was the women who had perhaps the freedom to be able to continue some of the things that they had done before. This is a woman on the Crow Reservation in the 1940s, fleshing a deer or antelope hide, and then a woman on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in the 1890s making pemmican. The fact that these women knew how to do this and continued to teach younger women as best they could in the face of being told to become sort of modern American women is impressive, but it was also really essential for their survival because a lot of their food came from what women were able to gather. And there were slaughterhouses built on the reservations, and those slaughterhouses would distribute beef periodically to the tribal members, but there was never quite enough. And the women would literally go around and pick through all the carcasses and all the offal, everything that was thrown away, every little bit that they could save. The bones, anything they could, they would crush up and make food out of. So a lot of work. Rations were also used as sort of an inducement to get tribal members to exploit their natural resources. This photograph is taken on the Blackfeet Reservation, and these men have been hired to cut any merchantable timber off this portion of the reservation. And you know the Blackfeet Reservation doesn't have a lot of timber except on that western side that later became Glacier National Park. And this is pre-Glacier National Park. So pre-1896, or 1910. But they've been hired to do this, and they're being paid in rations. Again, this is food that they were already owed, according to their treaties, payment in kind for land taken. But the Indian agent is withholding some of the food from distribution to the rest of the tribe and saying, we'll pay you if you cut down the timber. Well, guess who profited from that timber? It was used to build agency buildings, and the trader was able to sell lumber back to the tribal members at a profit, even though it's their lumber. Allotment and this whole assimilation process also changed family structures. There's a lot of emphasis on a nuclear family. This is the Mudhead family from the Blackfeet Reservation in this picture, and I love this little expression. Look at that. She's like, ah. And I just wonder, what's she looking at? But that was held up as being the model. This conflicted with a lot of tribes' kinship systems. For example, the Crow tribe has a very extensive clan system. And by that clan system, you know who you are responsible to take care of and who is responsible to help look out for you. When that clan system is broken up and Indians are told, take your dad's name, and everybody in the family gets Mudhead as their last name, and be a nuclear family and be the individual living on your individual allotment, that system is starting to break apart. It's not entirely gone, but people cease to be quite as responsible for each other as they had been in the past. More focused on the individual and sink or swim on their own. That is the model that the United States was aiming for. Make each one responsible for himself or herself. I couldn't resist this title. You'll have your school and pay for it too. Again, the school lands were taken at the time of survey out of the tribally controlled lands and not considered open for allotment. They were already set aside, as were different townships. Polson, for example, was set aside during this time, the land for that town. This is Crow Agency. And on that landscape, you'll notice there's an alteration. Things are starting to change, this permanent structure. And I love the juxtaposition of these teepees that, overnight could be gone. Other than campfires, you're not going to notice a lot of stuff left behind that shows that there were people camping there. And then you have these, fairly permanent structures that are going to be there for decades. This particular picture, Crow families are camping close to the agency because the agency school on the left-hand side is where their children are being taken. So not only are families and individuals kind of being pulled out of the tribe and being taught to think of themselves as just themselves, but children are also being taken out of their families. This is part of the federal boarding school policy. And yes, the tribes are paying for the construction of those schools, the teachers, the supplies, etc. The mission of the schools is, of course, cultural reprogramming. And this is St. I think this is St. Labray, which is still operating today, by the way. So that children would receive instruction in English, instruction in religion, often Catholicism, but not always. And this process essentially made children into orphans because they're growing up in an environment. Some of them are taken as little as 4 and 5 years old and may spend several years in the boarding school. They're growing up in an environment where they don't have a family. Consequently, they're not learning how to be a family. They came out of the boarding schools and they were, generally speaking, horrible parents because they had never had parenting modeled to them. So it had, and continues to have, pretty big social implications. Also, the other thing that children are missing is that, kind of like the land is sort of embraces tribal history. The landscape doesn't. Tribes could move across the landscape and remember this is where the Grovants and the Crows got into a fight. This is where so-and-so lived for a long time. This is where the chief was killed. All these different things that were markers of their history and events that happened over time. Families were, in the same sense, the vehicle for the transmission of culture and identity to children. So when those children are taken off the landscape, taken away from their families, they are separated from that knowledge. They aren't able to learn the same things that their parents or grandparents knew. So there's a big gap. And when some of them go back to the reservation or graduate out of the boarding schools and return to their families, they realize they don't speak the language, they don't know the ceremonies, they don't know the history, they don't understand themselves as tribal people. This is Fort Shaw. The United States had 26 federally operated off-reservation boarding schools. This was the one that happened to be in Montana, and it took students primarily from Montana and Idaho, although there were a couple from Wyoming, a couple from Washington, and I think a couple from the Dakotas. So Fort Shaw, is fairly well known amongst Montanans as being the school of the 1904 basketball championships of the world, the Fort Shaw girls basketball team. But Fort Shaw is also the school that sent those girls to the World's Fair to be the success story, the model of assimilation. See how well they did. They used to be Indians, but now they're these lovely dusky maidens. That's what they were called, the dusky maidens, who can play the mandolin, and they can sing, and they can dance, and they can embroider, and they can recite Hiawatha, and they can play ball. So let's look at some of the long-term repercussions of the assimilation era and allotment. One of the problems that allotment created was with regards to legal jurisdiction. What laws apply to which area of the reservation. Is it trust land, therefore federal law applies? Or is it state land, for example, land that was set aside for schools or for certain townships? Or is it tribal law because it's on fee patent land that's owned by a tribal member? So we have different series of laws that can apply depending on where you're located on a reservation. This is why certain crimes have been really difficult to prosecute on reservations, and why in some cases what would be a misdemeanor if it occurred on tribal land or state land ends up being a felony because it occurred on federal land. Really problematic from a law point of view. There's also the mismanagement of trust lands and individual Indian money accounts. Trust lands, the BIA oversaw them and would often lease them out on behalf of the Indian who was allotted that land, and lease them out for grazing or oil and gas exploration or drilling. That money would go then into an individual Indian money account that was held by the BIA or the Department of the Interior, and supposedly that money then was returned bit by bit to that individual tribal member. Well, we all know how well that worked out. If you haven't seen, by the way, 100 Years, it's a documentary about Eloise Cabell when she sues for successive interior departments about the mismanagement of those trust funds. It's actually on Netflix now, and it's called 100 Years. Other repercussions, poverty. Poverty just skyrocketed during the assimilation and allotment era. And sometimes because of that poverty, racism really went up along the borders of the reservations. And on the reservations where white neighbors who were able to make a go of it said, well, the problem is you Indians are you're poor because you're lazy. Or you're poor because you want to be dependent on the federal government to provide for you. Or because you're incapable of success. So there's a lot of confusion and a lot of problems there that only are exacerbated by this system. Another factor, of course, is that tribal enrollment today, in a lot of cases, is tied back to those original allotment rolls. For example, at Fort Peck, if you wanted to get enrolled, Fort Belknap. You want to get enrolled at Fort Belknap, you would have to prove that you are related to one of the original allottees. Well, we know that the allotment process was flawed. There were people who were tribal members who, for whatever reason, never received allotments. There were people who were not tribal members who very conveniently did receive allotments. So this is problematic. The other thing gets tied to is this issue of blood quantum. Blood quantum was the federal government's way of determining how much Indian heritage an individual had. It has nothing really to do with blood, other than that they thought of blood as sort of being the genetic determinant. So the federal government today uses 1/4 blood quantum in order to consider a person an Indian person for federal purposes. Some tribes also use blood quantum to determine whether or not a person is eligible for tribal enrollment. And in some cases, allotment was tied to blood quantum. On the Osage Reservation, which is not in Montana, for example, you could have greater head rights if you had a higher blood quantum, and lower head rights, say you had only a 1/32 blood quantum, then you would only get a 1/32 head right. I'm going to talk a little bit about blood quantum at the end here, but other, of course, impacts are that lands remain fractionated, and there are tribal lands now that have been inherited from one allottee to that person's heirs and down 4 and 5 generations that have hundreds, literally hundreds of owners of that land. What do you do with it? How do you figure that out? How do you who manages it? Who determines what happens to it? Who benefits from it if it is being leased out for oil? Maybe you're getting money in and everybody gets a check for $1.12. The other aspect of the Dawes Act that came to play was that Indians eventually, through fee patent status, would become U.S. citizens. And of course, in 1924, the 1924 Citizenship Act passed that made Indians citizens of the United States. But There's two different ways of being citizens. Going through the fee patent status, Indians didn't really have a choice whether or not they accepted citizenship or not. If their land reverted to fee patent status, the United States regarded them, in most cases, as citizens, whether they wanted that or not. But when the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act passed, it was recognized that there were a lot of Indians who still held their lands in trust. And one thing that act did said they don't have to have that land move out of trust status and into fee status in order to become American citizens. These are 4 different reservations in Montana where allotment took place. The Crow Indian Reservation, Blackfeet, Fort Peck, and the Flathead. And the reason I have these ones up is because Fort Belknap and Northern Cheyenne have both managed to hold on to upwards of 95% of their tribal lands. Partly because the land fit the number of people and for other reasons. Fort Belknap, for example, took in a lot of people from the Turtle Mountain Chippewas in North Dakota who couldn't get allotments on that reservation because it was too small, so they made a lot of allotments on the Fort Belknap Reservation. Rocky Boy's not on here because the Rocky Boy Reservation was created in 1916 and wasn't allotted. So this just gives us a sense of what happened to the land after the allotment process. And the dark blues are these tribally owned lands that are still in trust. And then you can see that there are other portions, non-Indian ownership. 1/3 of the Crow Reservation is under non-Indian ownership. And that small portion is largely due, this 18% of tribally controlled land, as in the whole tribe controls it, is largely the Wolf Mountains that Plenty Coups made sure were protected. You'll notice here on Fort Peck, this is all fee or state land, 54%, more than half of it. Partly because homesteading flooded into it in the 19-teens, and then oil drilling came in afterwards. The Flathead and the Crow reservations similarly had an issue with, because they were regarded as prime agricultural land, a lot of that land very quickly moved out of Indian hands and into white homesteading lands. So in 1928, the federal government conducted what was called a study and resulted in a report called the Merriam Report. And the Merriam Report basically condemned the entire reservation process. Said all we've done is exacerbated poverty. We've created these paupers who are dependent on the government, and then we've told them you've got to try to make it on your own, on your little plot of marginal land, and it wasn't possible. Nobody could have done it. They even said that even an experienced white man couldn't have done that. So the Merriam Report really says the Dawes Act is a big failure. But it doesn't go so far as to say, let's not try to assimilate these Indians. However, it does sort of pave the way for a new piece of legislation, the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. And there are pros and cons to this act. On the one hand, on the positive side, it ends allotment. But really, this is a matter of too little, too late. Between 1887 and 1934, tribal reservation lands in the United States went from 138 million acres to 48 million acres. Basically 90 million acres gone in just a few years' time. So what was protected, the trust lands that were protected, were really just a tiny fraction of what remained. It does protect trust lands from converting into fee status lands, so they could not be alienated from tribal members. It encouraged things like greater tribal control over their own destiny, although that's sort of a mixed bag when you look at this list. And they lifted certain bans on cultural ceremonies. Part of the Indian Reorganization Act says that students can attend day schools. They don't have to go to boarding schools. And by 1934, a lot of them were already attending day schools anyway. But good to have mentioned it, right? And they encourage things like Native American crafts, language retention, cultural things that made tribes interesting, basically. On the other hand, the IRA also creates these tribal councils to be the new governing body for any tribe that decides to adopt this form, these IRA governments. And those new councils are based on a corporate board model. You got your president, your vice president, your secretary, treasurer, your X number of board members, and they control the destiny of the tribe. And when that model is created, it is very much not the model that any indigenous group would have put forth if they had been allowed at that point to determine their own form of tribal governance. It wasn't based on anything cultural or traditional within tribes. Basically, it was just a one-size-fits-all, very Western model imposed upon IRA tribes, saying, hey, you can do this, and here's a new form of government, and now we're going to let you govern yourselves. What happens, which is not surprising, is that English-speaking Indians, often mixed bloods, very, very assimilated, ends up being the ones who gain access to the tribal council, and therefore they have a lot of power on the reservations. Well, I thought of a diversion, but I better not. And it's not these traditional tribal leaders, because it's not a traditional model. Interestingly enough, the Secretary of the Interior still retains a lot of power over tribal affairs. While they're telling them you're going to have your own government, you're going to manage your own affairs, in fact, the Secretary of the Interior gives the thumbs up or the thumbs down to all of their constitutions. And the constitutions that are created for tribes under the IRA are boilerplate. Take out a name, stick in a new name, boom, here's your constitution. So not taking into account the fact that different tribes had different needs or different social structures or things that need to be built into their constitutions. And under the IRA, the BIA would still manage those tribal trust lands. That didn't turn out so well. So I want to talk a little tiny bit about this before we're done. Blood quantum is problematic. It's also something that is left over from the allotment era, but even deeper than that. Blood quantum originated in the slave trade, when there were these terms that were placed on mixed African American and European, or sometimes Native American, African American, European American people. And blood quantum really is a formula for extinction, a mathematical formula. And this cartoon says, hey, wait a minute, we're disappearing. Because once you hit that threshold of not having enough Indian blood, you're not eligible to be enrolled. My daughter, for example, is about 1/16 away from being able to be enrolled because her blood quantum doesn't meet that criteria. This is true for countless thousands of people, and it throws tribes into a problem today. We have a legislator from the Blackfeet Reservation, House District 16, Susan Weber, who's from the Blackfeet tribe, and I was speaking in her class recently up at Blackfeet Community College, and she said, you know, Laura, a few years ago I sent basically all the math into the UM math department, looking at all the different members of the tribe. She took all their names out, by the way. But looking at all their blood quantum and the whole intermarriage patterns, and she said, can you figure out an equation that'll tell us, one, when we have no more full bloods, and two, when no one will be eligible? We have like 17,000 people enrolled in the Blackfeet tribe. A lot of them don't live on the Blackfeet Reservation, but that's how many there are. And she said, how long will it take? How many generations? It's going to take one generation before there are no full bloods on the Blackfeet Reservation. 2040 or so. And she said it'll only take maybe 1 or 2 generations after that when no one will be eligible by 1/4 blood quantum of Blackfeet ancestry to be enrolled in the Blackfeet tribe. So they have to think, what can we do now to think of other criteria for tribal membership? When the language has been stripped out of them and the culture has been stripped out of them, and then blood quantum is being applied, those are 3 factors that are going to be gone. So tribes are really facing a pretty challenging situation at present to determine who's going to be tribal members into the future. Huh.
Wasn't that the goal?
That was a big part of the goal, definitely. So if you guys have any questions, we have just a couple of minutes, and I'm happy to take a question or If we want to just do it afterwards? Okay, Martha says we'll do questions afterwards. Thank you all so very much.